So a lot of this can be kind of reviewed from our last page of notes. Rate of change, we know another word for rate of change is slope, so I'm going to go ahead and write slope above this. Okay, so we know in order to find our slope or our rate of change we need 2 points. So I see 2 points already bolded, so I'm going to go ahead and use these. This point is located at 0 because it does not move along the x-axis, but it does move down 3, so that's going to be 0, -3. My other point here, x always comes first, so it moved 2 along the x-axis and then up 1. So this is located at 2, 1. I always want to label the x comes first and then the y. So to find the rate of change or slope, it's the change in y divided by the change in x. So we always start with our fraction bar with a minus sign on top and bottom, because to find the change in something you have to subtract. Y's rise, so my y goes on top, and its x has to be directly below it. So the y rises, the one on top, that 2 has to drop directly below it. From here, if you want to do it in your head or do it by hand, that is great, but I would also like to make sure that you check it in the calculator. So I'm going to go ahead and open my calculator, and I'm going to type it in exactly as I see it. So it's a fraction, so I'm going to press Control Divide. On the top, we had a -3 minus 1. On the bottom, we had 0 minus 2. So that came out to be a +2. All right, let's see, does that make sense? So you read slope kind of like you read a book from left to right. As I move from the left to the right, the line is going up. So it does make sense that our slope is a positive. Okay, we also know slope is rise over run. So I'm going to turn it into a fraction by dividing it by 1. And let's check ourselves. So do I rise 2 and run 1 to get from point to point? So let's check. Start here. Rise 2, run 1. I'm still on top of that line. Rise 2, run 1. So I know that's perfect. All right, now we just have to write the equation. My m, we already calculated it, was 2, so y equals 2x. B is your y-intercept, so you're looking at your y-axis. This line crosses your y-axis right here. So it crosses at -3, so your y-intercept is a -3. Good. Rate of change, slope. We need 2 points. This point is located at 0, 3. My next point is located at 1, 2, 3, 4, 4, -1. So the change in y divided by the change in x. So I start with my fraction bar with a minus on top and bottom. The y rises, so that x has to drop directly below it. The y rises, so the x has to drop directly below it. All right, so from here you can do the calculations on your own, but make sure you always check yourself by typing in the calculator exactly as you see it. So on top we had 3 minus -1. On the bottom we have 0 minus 4. That came out to be a -1. All right, so does that make sense? So you read slope like you read a book, left to right. As I go from the left to the right, the line goes down, so it does make sense that my slope is a negative. Now let's check, does my rise over run work? So I turn it into a fraction by dividing it by 1. Because it's negative, I don't want it to rise. I want it to go down 1, run 1. So let's check. From here, go down 1 over 1. I'm still on that line. Down 1 over 1. So I know I got it correct. All right, my equation. We know the slope. We just calculated it, so our m is a -1. We always put x behind it. My y-intercept, so look where it crosses the y-axis, is right here. That is at a +3, so I'm going to put a +3. Okay, there's nothing wrong with this answer, but it's not exactly proper, and I will never see my answer written this way in a multiple choice. The way I would see it is y equals -x plus 3. It's unnecessary to have that one. It's not that it's wrong, it's just you won't see an answer choice written that way. All right, x is y, so we need to pick 2 points for the rate of change, my slope. So I'm going to pick the first two. Label everything. I want my change in y's over my change in x's. So I start with a fraction bar minus on top and bottom. Y rises, so 6 goes on top, that 1 has to go directly below it. 12 goes on top, 2 goes directly below it. All right, so from here you can either do it by hand, but always check yourself in the calculator. This comes out to be a positive 6. So when I write my equation, y equals mx plus b. So I know y equals, my slope is 6x. Now I just have to figure out my y-intercept. Well, I don't have a story here to tell me my starting point. I don't have a graph to look at where it crosses the y-axis. So I know the y-intercept is the y value when x is 0. I don't have any x's or zeros, but I know that that would be right here. So now I have to figure out what would this value be. So notice, as I move up 1 each time, I am increasing by 6, and that should make sense because our slope was a positive 6. So if I want to move backwards, instead of adding 6, I'm now going to subtract 6. So 6 minus 6 is 0. I want you to fill that in on your chart, and I want you to label it as your y-intercept. So when x is 0, my y is 0, so plus 0. Okay, you'll never see your answer written that way because a plus 0 is unnecessary, so you'll only see it written as y equals 6x. Rate of change, 2 points. Use the first two, why not? So I'm going to write them down and label them. X, y, x, y. Slope is the change in y divided by the change in x. So I put my fraction bar with a minus sign on top and bottom. Y rises, so that negative 1 goes on top. The positive 1 drops directly below it. For my next point, the y rises, so 1 goes on top. That 2 drops directly below it. All right, so you can calculate this by hand, but please make sure you always check by typing it into the calculator. This one comes out to be a positive 2. So let's write our equation. My m, my slope, we just calculated to be 2. Always put x behind it. All right, so we need to find our y-intercept. So I don't see where x is 0, so I know it would come right here. So what I need to do is figure out how is it changing each time. Well, I notice it's being, we are adding 2 every time, and like we said, that should make sense since our slope was a positive 2. So instead of adding 2, to go backwards, I need to subtract 2. Well, this is a negative 1, so negative 1 minus 2 is negative 3. Okay, so I want you to point at this in your table and make sure you label it as the y-intercept. So when x is 0, my y is negative 3, so I'm going to put minus 3. And there's my equation. Okay. Ashley decided to save a portion of her paycheck each month. When she started saving, she had $100. So started saving, that's important. She had 100. After 4 months, she had 200. After 8 months, she had 300. So let's fill out our table. We know that x always comes first, y comes next. So at time 0, I know she had $100 because that's how much she started with, right? I'm going to go ahead and label this as the y-intercept so we get used to anytime we see x is 0, we know it's our y-intercept. Well, I know after 4 months, she had $200. And after 8 months, she had 300. So now that I have my table filled in, I need to graph it. Okay, so here's my x-axis, here's the y-axis. My x-axis is time in this story. We need to make sure we start at 0. And looking at these numbers, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to count by 2's. My y-axis in this story is talking about her savings, so I'm going to go ahead and label this as savings. And if I look at my numbers, 100, 200, 300. So a good thing to count by would either be 100s or maybe even 50s. I'm going to go ahead and count by 50s. Okay, now we need to plot our points. Well, at time 0, she had $100, so for above 0, I'm going to go put a dot at 100. I know at 4 months, she had 200, so above 4, I'm going to go put a dot at 200. And at 8 months, she had $300, so above 8, go put a dot at 300. There's my graph. Oops. Oh well, close enough. Okay, B wants my rate of change, slope. So I need 2 points, so I'm going to take the first 2 points. Label your x's and your y's. We know it's the change in y's over the change in x's, so I start with my fraction bar with the minus on top and bottom. Y rises, so 100 goes on top, 0 goes directly below it. Y rises, 200 goes on top, 4 goes directly below it. So you can go ahead and calculate this, but make sure to always check your answer using the calculator. And it comes out to be a 25. Okay, C is asking for my initial value and what does it represent. So remember, initial means starting. So I know my initial value, my starting value was 100. So not only do I have to write it, I need to write what does it represent in this story. So what does this 100 mean? Well, I know that it's going to mean that she has $100 in savings at the very beginning at time 0. So it represents Ashley had $100 at the very beginning. Okay, it wants me to write an equation. Well, I know the equation is y equals mx plus b, but it's not wanting me to use a y and x this time. It tells me to write a function model, aka write an equation to describe the savings s in terms of time t. Well, typically we use y, but I know y is talking about savings, so instead I want to use the letter s. M, we already calculated. Our slope we calculated as 25. Typically we use x, but x is representing time, so they're telling me to use t instead of time. So B is our y-intercept, our starting point. Well, I know she started with $100. This is my equation, my function model. I'm going to make this a little bit curlier of a t so I know it's not a plus sign. Okay, I'm going to zoom out. So, domain. We know domain is x. Instead of an x, they're using a t. We know t stands for time. So that's very important. Anytime you're doing domain and range, make sure you understand what letter they're using and what does it mean in the story. Okay, so domain is talking about time. Well, there's nothing in the story that tells me that there's a maximum amount of time that she's going to be saving money. But time always has a restriction because the smallest amount of time you can ever have is 0. So we have one restriction. So when you have one restriction, you start with your letter. In this case, it's a t. You're going to leave a space and you're going to put your restriction, which is 0, because the smallest amount of time can be a 0. So in this story, is the amount of time that she's saving greater than or less than 0? Well, I know it has to be greater than because time cannot be negative. I know it can also equal 0, which was the very beginning. So I know the domain is talking about the time that she's going to be saving her money is going to be greater than or equal to 0 months. Range. We know range is y, and instead of y, they're using an s in this case, and s stands for savings. Okay, so if there's no restriction on how long she can save, there's no restrictions on how much that she can save. Except, I know the lowest amount that she's going to save is what she began with, which is that $100. So there's one restriction, that $100 where she started. So I'm going to start with my letter, leave a space, and then put 100. Well, I know her savings will be greater than that $100 because she's adding to it. It also could be equal to because that's where she started. Okay. The population of Webb County, Texas for the year 2000 through 2010 is shown on the graph. So before we begin the problem, there's a lot going on here. So let's look at our axes. This says number of years since 2000. So this 0 represents 0 years since 2000, so this would be the year 2000. This would be the year 2002, 2004, 2006, and so on. My y is the population, but it's my population in thousands, so this is 100,000, 125,000, so on and so forth. So it wants me to find my rate of change, my slope. So we know we need 2 points, and it gave us 2 points, so I'm going to go ahead and use those. And I'm going to label change in y over the change in x. Start with the fraction bar with the minus on top and bottom. Y's rise, so this 193 goes on top, the 0 goes directly below it. 250 goes on top, 10 goes directly below it. So when you work this out, or check yourself in the calculator, it comes out to be a 5.7. All right, B, what is the initial value and what does it represent? So initial value is the starting point. So here's where it starts. It's starting at 193. So now I have to put, what does that 193 represent in this story? So I know this 193 is the population in thousands. So I'm going to write the population was 193,000. Okay, so I know it was 193,000, the population was, in the year 0. Remember, this means 2000. So in the year 2000. Because the 0 is talking about your x, that means it's the year 2000. The y is talking about your population. So I know this was the population in the year 2000. Okay, let's write a linear function, which means the equation. So we already calculated m, our slope, which was 5.7. Our b, our y-intercept right here, started here, which is at 193, so I put plus 193. Oops, wrong way. It wants to know if this trend were to continue, what would the population be in 2015? Okay, well this is a year, so I know that this is talking about my x's. Since x is years, y is population. So I know that this is an x. But 2015, when the x is not 2015, because x is the number of years since 2000. Well, I know if it's 2015, that's been 15 years since 2000. And the whole reason we write equations is so we can plug in for x and make predictions for y. So I'm trying to figure out what would the population be if my x is 15 years after 2000. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take 5.7 and I'm going to multiply by 15, this x. And don't forget to add that 193. All right, so let's calculate that. So 5.7 times 15 plus 193. All right, so I know my population is 278.5, but I can't forget that the population is in thousands. So if that pattern was to continue, we would predict this would be the population in the year 2015. All right, domain. We know domain is x. We know X in this situation is years since 2000. Okay, on our graph, I can see two clear stopping points. It starts here, and remember, domain is X, so you can only use these numbers. So it starts here at an X of 0, and it goes all the way over here to where X is 10. So we have two clear stopping points. So whenever you have two clear stopping points, you start with a small number, leave a space, then write your big number. Domain is X, so that's the letter I use in the middle, and we always use less than symbols because we start with the smaller value. So over here when X is 0, that is a closed circle, so I need the solid line underneath. Over here where X is 10, that's also a closed circle, so I need to make sure I have that solid line under both of those symbols. Range is Y, which in this case stands for population. Range are these numbers only, right? So range is from the bottom to the top. So the lowest it goes is right here, and my Y value is at 193. You see that? This is your X, this is your Y. So my Y starts at 193 and it goes all the way up here to this point. This is the X, so this is your Y, range. Two clear stopping points. So it starts at 193 and it goes all the way up into 250. So since we have two clear stopping points, write the small one first, leave a space, and then write the big one. Range is Y, so that letter goes in the middle. We use less than symbols because we always start with a small number. At this lowest point, that's a closed circle, so I need to have the solid line underneath. At the highest point, that's also a closed circle, so I need to have that solid line underneath. Alrighty, that's it.